Hey Siri, how many days have passed since August 21st?
It was 152 days ago.
Alright, so what we have here is a 152 old day bin. And what happened 18 days ago was that I had set the bin up for migration. And what that really means is that I'm trying to get the worms to exit the finished compost. So to try to get that to happen, first I started out by just not feeding the bin for quite some time. And then I switched over to feeding, but I placed the feeding on only one edge of the bin, which is this side of the bin. And in addition to the food, which has been placed over here, trying to lure the worms out of the finished compost, I'm also covering only with that piece of paper to allow this side of the material to dry out nicely. Over here, the plastic is intended to keep the moisture locked in and recirculating. And you can tell right away how much darker the material is over here from being a little bit more damp. So combined with the extra moisture and the food supply, the idea is that the worms are going to want to move out of the finished compost all on their own. And it's been 18 days now since that started. In between then and now, there has been one extraction of worms, which occurred 6 days ago. So during the first 12 days, I allowed for this migration to happen. 6 days ago, I came in here and I scooped out the contents of this, moving the worms over into a new location, but then recycling a lot of the uneaten food, unused bedding to rebuild this feeding area. So the only significance of 18 days is that it's my record, basically. So I did have one occurrence where in 18 days, all of the worms migrated out of the finished compost. I'm not counting on that to happen here. But I figured since 18 days have passed, it would be worthwhile to just check in, see how things are progressing here in this bin. And my only other idea here was to just make sure that there's enough food in this feeding area to just keep this process going steadily. So I'm going to put a little bit of extra food in here just to make sure that there's a good steady supply of food in here. Alright, so to get this job done, I do have some coffee here as well as a little tray of some kitchen scraps. And I don't know if I'm going to need more bedding. I'm thinking maybe not, but we'll see. If we do, we could throw in a little bit of extra bedding too. But before we go and replenish the food supply over in the feeding zone, it seems like it would be a good idea just to check how things are really doing out here. Because, like I said earlier, there was one occurrence where within 18 days, all the worms did actually evacuate the finished compost in one of my recently completed worm bins. And, you know, if that's the case here again today, then there certainly wouldn't be much need to replenish the food supply in the feeding area, because then the migration will have already been completed. I would at this point have to switch gears and start thinking about, you know, just relocating the last of the worms and harvesting the castings. So I'm just going to sprinkle all of this dry material that collected on the top surface over into the feeding area too. My assumption here is that we are going to be replenishing the food and covering things up, allowing this process to continue. But I always like to take all of this small fragments and get it over into the feeding area to keep things going over there. With all this partially broken down material, it serves no purpose out here amongst the finished castings. Now out here on the far end, I've already spotted one worm all the way down low. And I don't expect to see many, but if I do encounter one, I might as well place them over where they belong, which is over in the feeding area. Oh, I thought that I saw another one over here, but I'm not going to go crazy trying to hunt down each one to relocate them manually. I think this is already just giving us a basic indication that some worms do still need a little bit more time to evacuate the finished material here. And you could tell it's not entirely finished. There are scraps of tougher materials in here that have not yet broken down. And here and there we can still see worms hanging out. So I did expect that we're not done yet with this migration after only 18 days, but it was kind of nice to think that it might be possible. And I figured it would be realistic to just check it anyway, since that is my record so far. So why not keep tabs on it? And it did seem like after 6 more days of the worms working down whatever food was placed in there, to reinforce that food supply also seems to make a little bit of sense too, just to make sure it's working well. It is true that we did remove a large number of the worms from this container last time we were in here, so there's certainly not as many worms that need to be fed. And even now, as we're kind of in the middle of the collection of compost, we're still not seeing many additional worms. Here and there we're spotting one, but they're just scattered here and there. I don't see huge numbers of them in here, which is kind of a good sign. It means that they're responding to the drying out of the material. They're, finding that they don't like it as much, and presumably making their way over into the more damp side of the bin where the food and the moisture are. Even this little guy hopefully knows what to do. And if you had to count how many worms remain in this material, you could probably count them on on both of your hands. It didn't seem like there were that many. I could be mistaken. I turned up the material and then right away I could see 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's probably a good number of worms still remaining in this material. So we're going to give them a little bit more time to work their way out of there. And at the same time, I think by agitating the material this way, kind of tilling it up, possibly for the last time, we're also allowing it to continue drying, adding to the motivation factor. So, even over here on the very edge, okay, now we're starting to see a few more. On the very edge where there's a little bit more moisture, because the plastic does kind of spill out over onto the finished castings. Here we're seeing a few more worms. Like down low, I guess there's probably some sort of a juicy piece of food that was right there up against the little barrier wall. So it makes the material a little bit wet and muddy down there. Just the way the worms like it, so it's not surprising that there's a number of worms hanging out down there. And I'm not going to go picking all these little guys out one by one. These little guys, I think we're just going to allow, time. We're going to allow time for them to make their way over into the feeding area on their own. And it makes me wonder how much more time is really going to be needed. It does seem like it's working well. It seems like the worms are gradually evacuating the material as the food supply dwindles, as the moisture levels drop. They're definitely realizing that there's a better place to be within this bin, and they're making their way over to that better place. So I don't know. I guess after we feed, we might not have to wait that much longer. Now that we're 18 days into it, we could probably get back in here in another week or so and probably expect that we're close to the goal here of having all the worms move out of the finished compost. So now, as far as the fresh feeding is concerned, I usually like to put it on the very far edge, so that even if they've depleted the food over here, they're inclined to keep going further beyond to find the food that they need. So I'm going to dump that food all the way in the far end. I am encountering strips of cardboard, chunks of bedding we could use as sort of the foundation for this feeding. Quite a few large pieces. This piece right here, I believe, was actually this barrier, the old barrier that I was using prior to replacing it during the last feeding. So it's not a hard and fast barrier, though. It's riddled with holes to allow the worms to be able to pass right through it, make their way over into the feeding area. So So this looks pretty good. I guess we can plop in the fresh food, and it's not that much. I believe that the number of worms in this bin is continuing to drop pretty steadily, and I do believe we did probably get the vast majority of them in the first extraction. But I think by placing all these yummy food scraps in here, all these frozen veggies and fruits, as well as this coffee, we're pretty much ensuring that there's going to be way more food in here than is even needed, I believe. But you know what? Before we close things up here, I am curious to see just how this feeding area is coming along in terms of being populated by worms, and how the food is holding up too. So here we're seeing some of the bedding that was used in here, some newspaper scraps riddled with worms, as you can see. There's also a few pieces of food scraps littered inside of that bedding. So I'm glad to see that they're working it down, but it's not going to last forever. So as soon as that stuff's depleted, there's a fresh supply of it up against the back wall for them to proceed to. So here too we've got some, yeah, a whole bunch of worms have come over. Yeah, we've got a pretty good turnout over here. Pretty good for 6 more days of migration. Alright, so there's not much left to do here. This is really what I was after today. I just wanted to get the food supply replenished in here, check how the worms are doing. You know, I guess just on the off chance, verify that after 18 days I've not yet broken or matched my record for migrating worms out of a batch of finished compost. And all we have left to do now is to cover things up. So yeah, I like the way things look in here. I'm a little bit gooey and messy now from having touched the fresh feeding areas. Got a little bit of gook on me here, but it's not a big deal. I'll be able to get cleaned up after I've put everything away. So let's get everything covered back up here. I believe I'm going to try to cover up a little bit tighter up against the feeding area, just to really allow the finished compost section to ventilate thoroughly and allow it to get nice and dry. As nice as it is to have a little bit of dampness right here on the edge and the worms coming over to it, I'd really prefer to see this stuff dry out a little bit too, so that the worms really go full, you know, evac and just get the heck out of it entirely. And that's pretty much what we observed last time. The worms pretty much all just made their way out of this stuff over into the feeding area, and it was just as simple as scooping the contents of this out, relocating it into a new place, and then harvesting the castings out of the container. Alright everyone, well that was fun. I wonder how much longer it's going to take. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts about what you think. After 18 days though, you got to admit, we're doing pretty good here in terms of migrating the worms out of the finished compost. So let me get everything put away over here and cleaned up. I'm not going to take your time with that though, because that's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.